Something you'll notice about the Mario RPG series as a whole is that there's almost this miasma surrounding it, almost as if the series is cursed. And I don't just mean the Luigi in a dress kind. No matter the sub-series, no matter the popularity, no matter how much love fans have for them, time and time again, these series seem to suffer a terrible fate. Whether it be a juggernaut slowly collapsing due to mismanagement, taking the very company that made the series down with it, or a franchise that many wish had died early. One where a set of games so mind-blowing and beloved were suddenly corrupted into a monster simply wearing its face. Both Paper Mario and Mario & Luigi, once two titans of Nintendo's lineup, have suffered a terrible fate, almost as if there's something at the core of these series that made it this way. But despite discussion usually starting and ending with these two, they weren't the only attempt at a Mario RPG. In fact, there was one before both of them, one that set the standards of everything the two series would carry forward. Being such a massive, important game not just for the Mario RPGs, but the Mario series as a whole, and yet, it's rarely ever mentioned in this discussion. And the reason for that is that this curse started all the way back at the series' conception, arguably giving this game the worst fate of the three. There's something so odd about looking at Super Mario RPG in a modern context. Released at the tail end of the Super Nintendo lifespan, this game was a collaboration between Square Enix and Nintendo, attempting to bring Mario into the RPG realm, hopefully allowing for more people to get into a genre that was, at the time, struggling to attain relevance outside of Japan. The result was something truly special, a game that melded the best of its two halves, the complex story-driven worlds of RPGs and the goofy gamey fun of the Mario series, creating something incredibly charming. And with a combat system that was super unique for its time, an overworld structure that got rid of all of the eccentricities of the genre that often drove people away, and with a story and world that finally codified the Mario series into an actual world, it's not too shocking that it captured the hearts of many who played it at the time. And yet, you rarely ever hear people speak of it nowadays, almost as if the game never released. And here's the thing, this isn't the fault of the game itself, nor the fans of it. No, it's been forgotten for a very different reason, because the very same entities responsible for its creation to begin with almost seem to no longer care that it was made in the first place. And if this were some average ho-hum Mario spin-off, then it'd be unfortunate, but not much more than that. But what really makes this hurt is that it's anything but. It's a game that deserves to be loved and deserves to be remembered alongside the two pillars it spawned. And since neither Nintendo or Square seem interested in actually allowing that to happen, I guess it's up to me to do that instead. And so join me in the first part of my retrospective series on the Mario RPGs as I take a look at the first one, Super Mario RPG. Super Mario RPG starts like any other Mario game. Mario's on a walk before he comes across the mutilated body of a soldier with a single note in his hand, ominously stating, "No, okay, I'm just kidding." In actuality, you'll never guess the plot for this game. Bowser kidnaps Peach. Crazy. And so it's up to Mario to save the day, immediately heading for Bowser's Keep, starting the game where things usually end. And the weirdness doesn't stop there, as instead of the usual head-stomping escapades you'd expect, the gameplay here is something else entirely, which, isn't really surprising for anyone who knows what this term means, but at the time, it probably shocked a lot of kids. And after fighting through some of the Keep's guards, you eventually make your way to the throne room, doing battle with the Koopa King himself. Boom, bang, pow, he's done. And thus, the princess is rescued once again, and in record time too. And that's good because Mario's a busy man, he's got brunch with Toad at 2 and... Suddenly, without any warning, the Mushroom Kingdom is invaded by entities from another dimension, indifferent to any of the havoc they've just caused. And the entire cast here seems baffled by the events, even the Chancellor of the Mushroom Kingdom seeming thrown off by the fact that the bad guy this time isn't the one they usually deal with. In fact, whatever this force is, it's essentially ousted their main villain, their leader, and their hero in one fell swoop. But despite the implied dire circumstances, the tone's not really that serious. In fact, it never really is. The tone is remarkably goofy here, and yet it seems to contrast with the fairly menacing tone set by the main threat here. But that dynamic, the contrast between these two seemingly incompatible elements, that's almost a microcosm of the entire game. The epic scale of a massive RPG combined with the lackadaisical, almost cartoony tone of the Mario series. The depth and complexity of an RPG combat system Marioized and made more gamey. It's two sides that seem like they shouldn't fit together meshed into one package. One that's made stronger with how these opposing elements play off of each other. And nowhere is that more visible than the core of the game as a whole, and the thing that set it apart from other RPGs at the time, the combat. Super Mario RPG has a lot of the traditional mechanics you'd expect from a turn-based RPG of this nature. Each of the 4 face buttons has a different set of actions. A is for basic attacks, Y is for specials, X is for items, B is for defending and running away. Specials cost FP to use. Characters have HP that goes down when you take damage. Try to get your opponent's HP down to 0 before your entire party does. Boom, bang, bong, RPG stuff. And if this were all it had, it'd be a pretty basic, and I do mean basic RPG, as most of these abilities are pretty self-explanatory. You got moves that damage enemies, moves that heal, moves that raise people's stats, but beyond that, there's not really much going on with the mechanics. But being that turn-based battles like this are fairly divisive among some players, they had to do something to make the game appeal to all the platforming-loving masses of the time. And so the mechanic they came up with was one called timed hits. This is a mechanic where each attack has some kind of special input that'll make it way more effective. Like look at Mario's basic punch. This is just sad. But add a dash of timed hits and boom. Beautiful. Every attack has an input like this, even the ones you wouldn't expect, and it adds a degree of timing and variety to battles that they wouldn't otherwise have. You get attacks that require a well-timed button press, attacks that require you to hold down the button for a certain amount of time, attacks that require a well-timed button press, attacks that require you to spam the control stick, attacks that require a well-timed button press, attacks that require, did I say variety? I'm not sure about that. Okay, no, but seriously, I really appreciate what these add to battles for how simple they are here. In a lot of turn-based RPGs, even the ones I like, it's not uncommon for me to fall into a sort of holding pattern where I'm just aimlessly strolling through menus and selecting attacks. But here, I actually have to focus on what I'm doing, and that makes it a lot more fun, especially because even enemy attacks can be blocked with good timing, which means I actually, have to pay some kind of attention to what I'm doing here. This idea is just an inherently fun concept, and it's one that both of its successor series, but especially one of them, would take to its absolute extreme. And there's a reason why every one of these games uses the same basic idea in their combat systems. It's fun. And on top of that, it makes it much more fun for people who don't generally like RPGs, as in, I can actually recommend these games to everyone. Now, me, I just finished a playthrough of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, so, that should tell you where I stand on the whole debate. And side note, can we talk about some of these enemies real quick? Okay, you got the normal Mario enemies, your Goombas, your Troopas, your nuclear warheads, and then you got stuff that kind of feels like it fits in the Mario universe, but what in the good golly gosh was this thing supposed to be? I don't know if it's the mid-90s 3D funk or a developer with some very questionable preferences, but there are so many weird enemies here. This guy has an attack where he walks up to a party member, does a cool dance move, and then leaves. Peak. Choices like these may have seemed a little odd at the time for an RPG of this nature, but as you'll find out throughout this video, it's a bit of a running theme through the entire game, even in some pretty ancillary ways. Like I mentioned FP earlier, or flower points. This is the stat that lets you use special attacks, with more of it allowing you to do more damage and specials. But while normal RPGs would have you upgrade that through, grinding or something, Super Mario RPG actually has you exploring the overworld for upgrades to it, giving you extra FP from item blocks, NPCs, small quests, stuff like that. It's a cool way to turn something that could have just been another part of the level up system and instead making it into a reward that actually engages you with the game itself beyond the fights. And speaking of grinding, the game literally gives you free EXP when you get a star just because. Sure, they could have made you fight all these enemies manually, but instead they just give you a freebie just to be nice, and I kinda like that. I mean, come on, look at how cool this is. Actually, fuck this game. But while all of this is great in its own right, there's one area where that whole Mario flavor element completely changes everything, taking a part of RPGs at the time that was generally a lame bore and making it into one of the best parts of the game. I'm talking about the overworld. wow, I love exploring things outside of battles. Now there's a quote that's never been said by anybody about a turn-based RPG. But the question is, why? Well, I think it comes down to two core problems, one that's far more annoying than the other. On one end, the actual overworld part of RPGs is usually incredibly boring. Long hallways, branching path where one is the correct one and one leads to a potion. You might get an incredibly basic puzzle or two. Boom, bang, bong. RPG stuff. Needless to say, it's not very exciting to really explore in these games, as there's not really much going on from a level design perspective. No notable set pieces, no fun moments, just boring dungeon hallways. And while that would be frustrating enough, most RPGs from the time decided that the best way to mitigate said boredom was with annoyance. Everybody loves random encounters, if you remove everyone who's ever played a game with them from the equation. Flat out, and I say this as an RPG fan, random encounters blow. Like, firstly, I don't like being flagged down by random enemies in the overworld like I'm some kind of Walmart worker getting hassled about the location of Friskies brand fruitcakes. But secondly, it just makes exploring unpleasant. Every second I'm walking around, there's a risk that I'm going to run into yet another random encounter and waste even more time, only to find out that I wasn't even going the right way to begin with. And so it's these two things, the random encounters and the poor level design, that make exploring in a turn-based RPG a chore. And considering I'm bringing this up in a video on Super Mario RPG, you'd have to assume that it probably does something to mitigate these problems, right? Nope, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Nah, I'm just kidding. So how does Super Mario RPG address these two core problems? Well, firstly, the game's actually trying to be fun. The overworld takes a lot more inspiration from the Mario side of the spectrum, in that you're actually running around and platforming. Almost every area has some kind of gimmick that sets it apart, whether that be auto-moving platforms you gotta jump between, jumping from beanstalk to beanstalk, solving puzzles in a sunken pirate ship. Basically, there's a lot of variety to the actual things you're doing. You're not just roaming down linear hallways. No, you're actually playing a video game and having fun. Sometimes, maybe. Yeah, so the platforming is very interesting, and by interesting, I mean bad. I'm gonna do pro move right here. First try, baby! Thankfully, it only really gets annoying in a couple of places, so it's not that big of a deal, and honestly, with how much these add to the overall experience as a whole, I'm willing to put up with some occasional wonky platforming if it means there's actually fun stuff to do outside of battle. They even throw in an occasional minigame to spice things up, which is really fun. You got a hectic ride down a massive waterfall, a fast-paced trip in a minecart, a chase up a hill with Wario's half-cousin his family avoids. For fair reasons, probably. There's a lot of memorable moments from these sections, and these minigames and platforming sections really help liven up the boring parts of RPG exploration, making the part of an RPG that could only generously be described as gameplay into actual gameplay. Oh, and while we're addressing one of these problems, how about we take a look at Super Mario RPG's random encounters? See, the joke is that there aren't any. You see that guy there? You wanna fight him? Just run into him. Don't wanna fight him? Then don't. It's that simple. Not only is this a massive benefit for the pace of the game, as it's me choosing when to stop and battle, but it also makes avoiding enemies into its own kind of game, as the layout of the enemies is always crafted in such a way that you have to kind of weave through or by them. It takes something from RPGs that wasn't very fun and makes it into a gamey kind of experience, which is just another case of Super Mario RPG's Marioification of the entire process. And that's kind of the whole theme of the gameplay here. Mario RPG took elements of an RPG that could drive away players that aren't into them, or things that are kind of boring or annoying, and made them into something that's actually fun to play. It's an example of that added Mario flavor benefiting the contrasting RPG elements. But this exchange here is a two-sided coin, because just as said Mario flavor is used to spice up traditional RPG elements, said traditional RPG elements come in to expand something that the Mario series was never very good at before into something that was worth caring about. When you think of the Mushroom Kingdom as a place, what comes to mind? Big castle, Toad Town directly outside, scattered towns, deserts, icelands, like actual places. But if you ask someone the same question back in the early 90s, what do you think they'd answer? There's like blocks and a little mushroom dude. There's also like space. This is just straight up San Francisco. And Luigi, you doing okay there? The thing is, the Mushroom Kingdom at this point in time wasn't really a place as much as it was a collection of disparate ideas. Like, this was pre-Mario 64, as in Peach didn't even have a definitive castle yet. And so Super Mario RPG had the difficult task of taking all of this nonsense and making it into a world that could conceivably exist. And so, for the first time, the Mushroom Kingdom is an actual place. Littered throughout the game are an array of different towns, each with their own weird NPCs and culture. It starts out with, fittingly, the actual Mushroom Kingdom itself, a town with architecture befitting of the royalty present there. And Peach's castle itself is this extravagant, over-the-top place befitting of the Mushroom Kingdom's elegant leader and her sitting by the fireplace. NPCs here aren't just tutorial spouting window dressing either. They all have their own unique dialogue that gives each of them a sense of character and purpose. And while not all of the jokes land necessarily, the general quirkiness of the NPCs makes them feel much more memorable. And while this is the first town you come across, it's far from the only one or even the only style of town either. Because while we get this fancy smancy royal town, not long later we get to see what a more regular Toad Town would look like, with the far more quaint Rose Town. And unlike certain later Mario RPGs which are terrified of the idea of creativity, Mario RPG even gives us towns for other races. We have a mountainous civilization of moles, a city in the sky where the NPCs' heads are figuratively and literally in the clouds, and even a town made entirely up of monsters. And the architecture of all these places is super different as well. The Mole Town is more of a mining town, where the NPCs have formed their lives around the mountain itself instead of tearing it apart in order to craft normal houses. Monstro Town goes even further with this, the monsters making their home in the mountain itself, carving out a life for themselves in a remote area as to keep their peaceful way of life. And I mean, sure, not every individual race gets their own town, probably for fair reason, but it's still cool that the world and the characters that make it up were fleshed out like this. Even the more Mario-esque stuff gets contextualized by the game itself, being these in-between no man's lands where nothing has been properly developed, allowing the platforming segments to exist as an example of how the Mushroom Kingdom would naturally look. And even then, the variety in the environments is pretty impressive considering what they had to work with from previous games. Mario RPG has plenty of goofy set pieces where the music and visual design are as wacky and Mario-esque as you'd expect, and yet later the game may have you exploring the tranquil Star Hill, the calming music and surreal visual design giving the area an otherworldly feel. And yet, not long after, you may be exploring the ominous depths of the ocean before having to make your way through an uncomfortable sunken pirate ship haunted by the spirits of the crew who died trying to protect their treasure. It never gets too serious, obviously, like we don't see Mario exploring some post-apocalyptic town or something, but still, there's a lot of variety to the tone and structure of these places, and it feels remarkably impressive considering there are still Mario games releasing today that don't have this variety. And this is a case of the RPGification of the Mario universe resulting in something that feels more significant. They tried to make the world feel like an actual place with people worth saving, which does a lot in making the story feel like it actually matters. Like in other Mario games, it doesn't really feel like what you're doing means anything. Sure, you're trying to save the princess or whatever, but I don't have any reason to care about her or this supposed kingdom Bowser's causing problems for. But by fleshing out the world and the characters who inhabit it, it makes the conflict actually feel like I should care about it, which is, kinda nice. And speaking of which, the world isn't the only case where Mario RPG does something like this. As while the ancillary townspeople obviously matter to an extent, what matters even more here is the people you're exploring said world with. Mario, Bowser, and Peach's personality could pretty much be summed up by one word prior to this: hero, villain, girl. There really wasn't much to any of their personalities because, well, it didn't really matter. They were really just a framing device in the end. A goal to strive for, a person to fight against, and a person to play as. That's all that was really needed for a basic platformer. But considering, that an RPG kind of necessitates actual characters, it means that these characters have to be fleshed out with actual character. Bowser went from bad guy to a sensitive, egotistical blowhard. Every decision he makes has to be justified, both to himself and others, as him not actually doing anything good, even forcing Mario to join his party just so he can get a leg up on Mario. And yet the dude's a big baby who can't take anything for shit. Dude gets ignored and writes a haiku about how misunderstood he is. It's a great game. Peach, meanwhile, went from damsel in distress to someone who's not particularly into the whole letting Mario handle it thing. Like, she literally uses a scheme to get out of the castle to help Mario because she's sick of not being able to do anything. Heck, even Mario himself gets presented with elements of personality that he rarely gets nowadays, being this guy who really wants to help but is easily frustrated. He even gets his ego bruised by a kid because Bowser beat Mario in this toy game he's playing. Like, none of these are complex takes on their characters or anything, but at least they're actual takes. Like, they gave these goobers defined character traits, ones that would carry over into later games, and I'm not just talking about in the RPGs, but in the main series as well, and that's kind of impressive. But of course, those aren't the only members of the party. But unlike Mario, Peach, and Bowser, these two other ones were entirely unique to this game and this game alone. Mallow is a tadpole from Tadpole Pond that's thrown for a loop when he finds out that he's actually not a frog. Big shocker there, I know. And so he joins in on Mario's adventure, hoping to find his real parents and hopefully get over his cowardice to become a brave boy. Now, I'm of two minds about Mallow as a character. On one hand, he has an actual arc, one that's iterated on over the course of the game and concluded just when it feels like it should be. And on top of that, he has some really funny interactions with other characters throughout the game. On the other hand, dude's lame. Like, okay, I get the point of his arc. I know he's being a little baby because that's the whole idea. And maybe even a kid playing this at the time could have related to him or something, but to me, as a grown-ass adult, the constant crying kind of borders on pathetic. And to be clear, I felt this way when I played it as a kid, so there's that. Your first introduction to the character is falling flat on his face and then crying about it, and it's kind of hard not to think he's a bit of a goober after seeing this. Though I guess his lack of coolness may be partially because another character steals all of it for himself. Of all of the original characters in Super Mario RPG, Geno was the one that seemed to really resonate with people. Geno was a star spirit who's tasked with gathering the 7 star pieces to repair the Star Road, which is a thing that allows wishes to be granted across the world. To do this, he possesses a doll from Rose Town, using its body as a vessel for him to move around the mortal world. Flat out, Geno has one of the coolest designs I've seen for a character. This wooden doll with an incredibly cool hat and cape combo featuring the ability to morph into literal weapons to fire projectiles is pretty cool, okay? He feels really out of place and otherworldly design-wise, which fits incredibly well with his origin. And personality-wise, he kind of reflects that motif too, trying to look like some kind of cool hero, but always coming across as a little awkward, almost as if he only knows of how people interact instead of knowing how to actually interact with people. Or at least that's what I can gather from like the 5 lines of dialogue this whole game has. So yeah, let's talk about that. When you watch the cutscenes from this game, you can almost feel the producer standing over the writer's shoulder like, hey, this is taking too long, people are gonna get bored, get back to the game. Cutscenes are always fairly short, with dialogue tending to stay on the simple side, and even character interactions are fairly infrequent here. And while that probably keeps the pace of the game moving, it comes at the cost of leaving the characters a little basic. And it sucks because when the game actually allows for it, these characters have some really fun chemistry, and their interactions are usually really funny. But it feels like a lot of these characters get barely any time to shine. Still, while it may occasionally suffer from the persistent need to keep the gameplay rolling, story be damned, it's still fairly impressive how much Super Mario RPG manages to flesh out the Mario world while adding in some of its own unique elements. It makes the story and world feel more impactful, and it makes the game feel more significant as a whole. But speaking of those unique elements, there's an area where those elements get to truly shine. Because while the characters themselves are far more fleshed out and fun than any previous Mario game up to this point, it's the events they participate in that truly make Super Mario RPG shine. Something you'll already likely know if you have any experience with the Mario RPGs is that these games are weird. Like, really weird. While the overarching narrative may be more traditional, the games have a litany of smaller stories or vignettes that make up the majority of the runtime. And while typical Mario games would have them be something along the lines of a trek through a grassland, then a desert, then a water world, etc., the Mario RPGs are notorious for going out of their way to be as bonkers as humanly possible. Whether it be a fight against an otaku lizard in a literal dating sim, no, I'm not kidding, or a tournament arc that inexplicably also has an ongoing murder mystery, these games are absolute masters of coming up with interesting, utterly bizarre ideas and pulling them off in a way that no other series can quite match. And this didn't come from nowhere, because all the way back in 1996, Super Mario RPG was doing the same thing, and with its own creative brand of absurdity as well. It's funny because a lot of the beginning of this game is standard Mario fare. You know, princess, kidnap, Bowser, evil. But with the arrival of the Smithy Gang, that traditional Mario guff is both literally and figuratively thrown for a loop. After running to the Mushroom Kingdom to inform the Chancellor that, shit's getting kinda weird, you're suddenly sidetracked with the quest to help Mallow get his money back from this goober-ass thief named Croco. And already, the game has more new characters than most of the later Mario RPGs, hooray! While it's undeniably a simple setup, it sets the tone for the adventure to come. Not long later, you come to Rosetown, a quaint little toad village where the residents couldn't be happier. Except for the part where someone is just randomly raining arrows down on the poor town. These arrows inexplicably freeze people in place, and while little Timmy over here is slowly wasting away outside, his family completely unaware of his fate, Mario decides the best course of action is to go play action figures. But this kid's action figure, a doll named Gino, comes to life, and Mario has to follow him through a literal forest maze, kill about 1,000 bees, and beat the tar out of a literal living bow and arrow. And that's just the beginning of the absurdity these vignettes get into. In fact, it's here where the game finally starts branching out. Except this mole town, which kind of has this boring arc of like, oh no, the kids are stuck in the mines, go save them, Mario. I feel like that's a lot more serious than I'm saying, but I don't care, it's kind of boring. So not long after saving said mole kids, Mario is informed by a questionable bunch of shy guys that this guy named Booster has come across a girl that fell from the sky. And so you show up there ready to storm his manor and rescue the princess, but this is Booster, the latest descendant in a long line of wealthy people. And this dude is some kind of crazy level of unhinged. The character just seems to emit this bizarre energy, this unstable goofiness that makes it hard to tell whether he's malicious, stupid, innocent, or all three at the same time. There's this uncomfortable bad touch vibe surrounding him that's somehow contrasted with his naive innocence. Like one minute, dude's ready for the kill, and then the next he's gifting Mario a useful item for helping him find a doll. Dude's literally kidnapping someone while wanting to have a race up the hill. As I said, unhinged, both in personality and his job, because, like, how? And I like how this is even reflected in the design of his own house, being this bizarre cacophony of random rooms and objects with no real rhyme or reason behind them. The entire section is uncanny, but incredibly memorable because of that. Like, the tone is just so strange, always jumping from goofy to intimidating to weird to funny. It's easily one of the most fun arcs of the entire game. And honestly, I don't think the game ever quite matches this quality after this point. Though that doesn't mean there's no fun to be had. Upon entering the seaside town, it's immediately clear that something's off. The toads in this town seem super out of it, like they can barely focus on anything in front of them. And yet, there's a strange maliciousness behind them, like this untrustworthy energy that never quite goes away, not helped by their eerie understanding of what Mario's goal is when the NPCs shouldn't reasonably know about the star pieces. They say you need to head to a sunken pirate ship, which Mario heads to post-haste, encountering plenty of fun puzzles, spooky enemies, abominations, and even a fun battle with the leader of the sunken ship, Jonathan Jones. However, upon returning to the town, it's revealed that, there was a reason why all these toads were so creepy, because one of the Smithy Gang members, Yardovich, created uncanny clones of the residents while keeping the entire town captive in one building, using them as leverage to threaten Mario out of a star piece. And after this, we get the most exciting, most mind-blowing, most enthralling story arc of the entire game. Mario goes through several areas for 2 hours with no meaningful story progress. Your reward is getting humped by a star. Okay, so here's the thing about Super Mario RPG. The game is undeniably focused on taking the general pace and feel of an RPG and speeding it up and making it more Mario-esque. And while that's great a lot of the time, occasionally the game suffers under the weight of its own pace. I discussed it earlier when I talked about the lack of dialogue from the characters and the general briefness of the cutscenes, but this is a case where more of said cutscenes would have really helped with the pace. As it stands, you basically spend 2 hours with almost nothing happening. You run through an area, scale a cliffside, find a town with very little interesting to see, head back to the cliffs, take another path, run through the desert, go through an underground section, go through a garden, climb up the beanstalks, all the while you're fighting several enemies and bosses, taking up even more time, and then finally, after getting to the top of the beanstalks, you might get an actual, meaningful story section again. And this one's great. It's where we get to see the completion of the game's biggest character arc, a cool new town with a completely new race exclusive to Mario RPG, a really great set of villains, jiggle physics, and it's great, but why does it take 2 hours to get here? Exploring and platforming in this game is fun, but when it goes on this long with no meaningful break, it's hard not to get a little tired out by it all. Though this in-between section does have something incredibly interesting contained within it. It's just that you're unlikely to ever come across it on your own. When exploring Monstro Town, there are a wide variety of weird enemies all making their lives inside the cliffside. But bizarrely, one of these doors never opens, no matter how much you try to get in. And this door is rarely ever spoken of, the NPCs only speaking about whatever is next door with a confused concern, as if no one really knows who or what could be hiding behind it. However, with enough sleuthing, you'll come across this small girl in the mole town wanting to get a hold of some fireworks, and when you provide her with them, she gives you this mysterious stone with no clear use. However, if you head back to the door with the rock in hand, the door will miraculously open for you. And what waits behind the door is something the likes of the Mario universe has never seen since. An ominous, monstrous-looking figure walks up to you, his design decidedly unnatural for the world he's currently inhabiting. And that might actually be the case, as his dialogue heavily implies he's not of this world and shouldn't be here to begin with. I am Culex, Dark Knight of Vanda. I have crossed into this dimension to fight for the Dark Mage, but this world is uninhabitable for me and my kind. I am matter. I am antimatter. I can see your past. I can see your future. I consume time, and I will consume you. What follows is easily the hardest fight in the game, an all-out war where Culex and his gems mercilessly assault Mario and the party, the fight being almost impossible without the proper equipment. But with enough patience, Culex can be beaten, with the creature leaving Mario's world forever, bestowing a gift onto him for managing to best him. There's just something so unnatural about all of this. Just accessing the fight is incredibly obscure in and of itself, almost as if the game doesn't want you to find it. But even more than that, there's something utterly bizarre about Culex's existence in general. I mean, he's clearly not of this world, but despite the music implying otherwise, this isn't some fight from a random Final Fantasy game. Culex doesn't exist anywhere else. He was never in a Final Fantasy game, heck, he was never in a game to begin with. He's a creature without a home, an entity not of this world, but also not of any world. A digital phantom we've never gotten an explanation of, and a creature that we don't know the intentions of. There are a lot of interesting secrets and Easter eggs in Super Mario RPG, but none as perplexing as whatever the heck's going on with this thing. Though, thinking on it, a creature invading the world of the Mushroom Kingdom and enacting its influence on it, that isn't just a theme of this boss fight, but the theme of the game, as that seems to be the entire point of the Smithy Gang as a whole. The Smithy Gang are an interesting bunch of villains, sentient weaponry brought to life. Throughout your adventure, you come across a lot of Smithy's lackeys, usually causing some kind of kerfuffle for the citizens of the Mushroom Kingdom. And while they're technically the inciting incident, they're not always the main focus, as plenty of the adventure revolves around happenings entirely unrelated to their escapades. However, their influence, while not always obvious, is always present, with them actively trying to destroy the very way of life the citizens of the Mushroom Kingdom have. And it's after running through the entire world, seeing the natural beauty and fun of the Mushroom Kingdom, and then making your way into their world that the threat posed by the Smithy Gang becomes obvious. Smithy's dimension is cold and uncaring, the place being almost untraversable by normal beings. These wacky creatures you'd come to battle with just being one of a million identical clones, ones who have lost all capability to think or feel, serving as empty husks to terrorize the world with. This is the entirety of Smithy's dimension, and what he wants to make the Mushroom Kingdom into. All of the fun, all of the whimsy, and all of the life sucked out and replaced with an endless army of identical, unfeeling clones. This is the threat the Smithy Gang poses to the world at large, and potentially even more outside of that, as it's not too unlikely that once Smithy's done taking over Mario's world, he may end up doing the same to someone else's. An endless sea of worlds taken over and commodified, and the only thing standing in the way of that is Mario and his gang of friends. Now, like in-game, the actual way it's represented is not nearly as cool or as ominous as I made it sound here, as this is, after all, a 90s Mario game, but still, I think it's cool that there's even themes to analyze here to begin with. Mario may have had a story in the loosest terms, but what it never had was themes. It was just a goofy series about a plumber beating up turtles to save a princess. Nothing more, nothing less. The world was whatever they wanted it to be, and while you could be attached to the games themselves, there was nothing beyond that to get connected to. But Super Mario RPG was the game to change that. It gave the world a real sense of place and filled it to the brim with life and energy. It established what this world was like, what these characters were, and what Mario could be. And despite this being the first whack at doing this with Mario, a surprising amount of this stuck, not just for future RPGs, but for the Mario series as a whole. And when you watch the credits and see all these characters and places you visited, it's hard not to feel something. Not just because the game made all of it matter, but because this was the last time most of them would ever appear. Not long after Super Mario RPG released, Square Enix and Nintendo's relationship turned incredibly sour, with the two refusing to collaborate on anything for years, and all because Nintendo was too stubborn to give up cartridges during the N64 era. And while this allowed Nintendo to produce its own Mario RPG series, one that would go on to create some of the greatest games the plumbers ever starred in, the question was, where did this leave Super Mario RPG, the one that established this identity in the first place? And to answer that question, I'd like to tell you a little story. The year was 2010, and one warm summer afternoon, I was whiling away the hours watching YouTube videos. And while watching some fairly innocuous video on Super Smash Bros. Brawl, I began to hear something in the background, a song that immediately enraptured me. This would lead me down a rabbit hole that eventually led me to playing Super Mario RPG for the first time. And despite having played several of its successors, I fell completely in love with it, spending the better part of my 7th grade year obsessing over it. In fact, it's because of this game that I met one of my lifelong best friends, someone who I practically forced to play the game just so I had someone to talk about it with. But here's the thing, there's a reason I had to force him to play it to begin with, because he had never heard of the game. In fact, nobody I'd ever met even knew what I was talking about. I'd heard about several games, one's even older than this one, but I couldn't find a single person that even knew Super Mario RPG existed, because by the time I finally got to experience it for myself, the game might as well have been completely irrelevant. When looking at its treatment since release, you'd almost get the impression that neither Nintendo or Square Enix really cared that this game was even made to begin with. Years would go by with barely a passing mention, even while other Super Nintendo games were seeing a renaissance of love and adoration. It did get re-released a couple times on Nintendo's Wii and Wii U Virtual Console services, but even then, its release is always treated as low priority, oftentimes appearing just as the console it's currently placed on is nearing its end. And I mean, we're in the Switch's 7th year on the market. Super Nintendo games have been on the platform for years, and yet we still haven't gotten even the vaguest sign that this game is even going to appear on it. And all because Square Enix, in their infinite greed, won't make enough money by putting it on there. And while this is frustrating enough as a fan of the game that would like to be able to play it without pulling out decade-old hardware, the repercussions of this treatment have been far more detrimental than just some late console releases, as because of this lack of consistent ways to play the game, it's never able to gain new fans, leaving the existing community that do care about it to slowly wither away. Super Mario RPG always had a dedicated fan following, as even to this day there are people carrying its torch, hoping that something, anything from this once important game would reappear one day. And yet, in watching these, you can almost see in real time how this enthusiasm for this effort further dwindles and dwindles every year, as the chances of it ever getting that kind of treatment seem almost impossible. Even the main driving force behind the Super Mario RPG fandom, the attempt to get one of their favorite characters, Geno, into Super Smash Bros., a campaign that's had just as much support as other characters that did make it into the roster, and yet time and time again those wishes are met with an indifferent thud, as they couldn't even be bothered to spruce up the same hand-me-down Mii outfit from 5 years prior. And all because, again, Square Enix and their infinite greed won't make enough money simply by making people happy. And so with his clothes stolen, Geno sits in a locked box in Square Enix's HQ, alongside every other character from this game, ones that haven't even been as lucky as him. A locked box that may never open again. And I know that one day, maybe they will do something about it, and that I'll have some random commenter show up to tell me how this video didn't age well when Square Enix half-assedly throws it on the Switch. But here's the thing, even if that does happen, heck, even if we get more, it won't change the fact that for the better part of 3 decades, the game has been left completely and utterly irrelevant.